Okay, welcome back. Our next session, Playing with Time, Great Perfection History in Virtual Reality. I'm here to introduce the session leaders, who will then introduce our presenters. Our two session leaders are Lori Meeks, an associate professor of religion and East Asian languages and cultures at USC. There she is. Hi, Lori. And Mats Borges, the assistant director of USC's Ahmanson Lab and a resident trainee at the Zen Center of Los Angeles Buddha Essence Temple. So, Lori and Matt, over to you.
Right. So, we'll be introducing our speakers. Elaine Lai is a lecturer for civic, liberal, and global education at Stanford University. She's a scholar of Buddhism and completed her PhD in religious studies at Stanford earlier this year. Congratulations.
Thanks.
Aftab Hafeez, is that how you say it?
Yeah.
Okay. He's a spatial audio UX research engineer at Google. Aftab is also a visiting VR designer at Stanford University's Center for Spatial and Textual Analysis. They're here to discuss their project, Playing with Time, Great Perfection History in Virtual Reality.
Hi. Thank you guys so much. Thank you to all the organizers. Thank you to all of you for being here today. So this project was born out of chapter 2 of my dissertation called Heart Essence Literature Through Time. And just as a very quick background, this project is kind of a proof of concept. We made it with 0 funding. So I feel very early in the game here. And this was partially born out of the Center for Spatial and Textual Analysis at Stanford, where I was a fellow doing another project on an intertextual heat map. And I wanted to explore VR, so they kindly lent a headset and a forum to discuss ideas. And Aftab is my partner in real life, so I had this advantage of kind of workshopping and building a first proof of concept. So that's what we'll be sharing with you guys today. And I'll speak a little bit about how we decided to create this VR experience, and Aftab will speak on the technical aspects, and then I'll end with some future directions. So my area of focus, the heart essence, which is a strand of the Great Perfection, or Dzogchen, rose to prominence in Tibet around the 11th century and gained momentum in the 14th century when Tibet was undergoing a civil war. And today, heart essence, Great Perfection remains a very important living tradition. It's famous for its visionary experiences that you can see depicted in this mural on the left, and its scriptural emphasis on naturalness, spontaneity, and also a theory of Buddhahood, which locates awakening in this very body and in this very moment. So chapter 2 of my dissertation focuses on Great Perfection history, or Logyu. And history in this context means stories about the transmission of sacred scriptures from teacher to student. So in Buddhism, the unbroken transmission of teachings that begin with a Buddha or an awakened being and are passed down from teacher to student continuously into the present is extremely important for claims of legitimacy. And there's a saying in this tradition, and in fact, before any Great Perfection teaching today this happens, if a practitioner wishes to generate confidence in the Great Perfection's teachings, first, they must learn the history. And this is usually, there's several days of teaching, hundreds of pages of teaching of the history. Importantly, history is not located in the past, but in the present moment of hearing the history. And the etymology of the word Logyu in Tibetan reflects this idea. So history means familiarity, gyu, with what occurred many years prior, lo. Because it presents those events as if they were being seen right now, it is called a history. So very concretely, in the history of the Great Perfection, there are 3 different transmission streams linked to key 3 figures: Vairochana, Vimalamitra, and Padmasambhava, or the lotus-born one, who has become like the second Buddha for many Tibetans. And they're all purported to have lived around the 8th century. The 3rd transmission stream is my particular research area because it is the first time in this tradition of Buddhism that its major source scripture features a feminine Buddha speaking to an all-feminine audience. And I translated that whole scripture for my dissertation. So the Buddha is Samantabhadri, which is the Sanskrit feminine form for all good one, or in Tibetan Kuntuzamo. And the main disciple of these teachings was a young princess who we don't really have an image of, unfortunately, Princess Pemasel. And a Tibetan queen named Yeshe Tsogyal helped to transcribe and bury these teachings to be revealed in a future time. So as I was reading all these primary sources about Great Perfection histories, I felt the need to spatialize the relationships. On the one hand, the tradition was depicting relationships that are very complicated to trace on the page, reading from left to right. There are other conceptual challenges inherent to Great Perfection history as well. There are lots of figures described, and it's hard to pin down whether certain figures are contemporaneous with one another. Added onto that, some figures are reincarnations, so this is common to Buddhism, reincarnations or emanations of other figures, so they're continuous identities and not distinct ones. The sense of history portrayed by my primary sources is playing with different levels of time. They depict events and characters that exist outside of time, and those who are also locatable in definitive times and places. And finally, the mode of transmission of Buddhist teachings occurs in different forms which correspond with different relationships to time. So one is mind-to-mind transmissions, which you could say is prior to natural language, symbolic transmission, which also kind of occurs outside of time, and then finally, a hearing lineage, which you could say takes place through natural language in time and space. So it occurred to me while reading these sources hundreds of times myself and trying to figure out what was going on, that it would be extremely useful to both scholars and practitioners to have some kind of application where these relationships are depicted three-dimensionally. So why VR? First of all, the definition of history, according to the Great Perfection, is to make the one learning about the history implicated in all past events, completely immersed in the story. So far, VR is the best medium I could think of to create that kind of immersive experience. Two, accessibility. These histories are very text-heavy and it makes it hard to absorb, so we wanted to create a more embodied experience where users could move around the lineages and learn about different figures in whatever order they wanted to. A lot of monastics of this tradition are required to learn this history as well, and it's very hard for them, as I've talked with them about this. And so this could help expedite the learning process and increase retention. Also, recovery of a largely understudied tradition, especially the tradition that I study, even though it's cited all the time, there were a lot of ruptures in the transmission of the history due to the invasion in Tibet by the Chinese. And one of the scripture that I helped to recover and the histories I studied are part of the ongoing efforts, I guess, to recover these histories. And also, I've talked with this about with some of my Tibetan monastic friends, but the Tibetan language is unfortunately kind of dying. Monasticism is on the low. There are less and less people who are trying to become monastics these days. And so these attempts to make Great Perfection history more accessible and more easily learnable by monastics is something we felt could benefit the community overall. And I'll pass it on to Aftab.
All right, so Elaine talked a bit about the long and vast history of the Great Perfection. One thing to keep in mind is that this history, being so complicated as it is, has never really been diagrammed in a comprehensive and uniform way as we've done here. So when Elaine asked me to develop the VR experience, I needed first to sit down and get an understanding of what the history is, and as well as what the data and the variables were that we wanted to represent. So what you see here is one of many iterations that we did in 2D. This is just a portion of the entire history, which we spent about at least a month charting out. So some of the variables that we're representing in here, as well as in the VR experience, is the flow of transmission of knowledge from whom to who, the medium of transmission, so like Elaine said, whether it was mind-to-mind, symbolic, or via natural language, the emanations, so who is a reincarnation of who, and the flow of time, so whether it's nonlinear or linear time, as well as metadata about each of the individuals, so their names, the dates of their existence, as well as a description of them. Next slide. So what is the current VR experience? Right now, the app allows you to view the entire lineage tree holistically, so starting from the first Buddhas who exist prior to the concepts of time, all the way down to the 14th century. You can ascend and descend through the lineage tree, exploring different relationships between different entities from various perspectives. And you can click on each of the entities and learn more details about them, displaying their information on a panel that looks like a traditional Tibetan scripture called a Pecha page. So we have a video that can kind of give you a preview of the experience. We'll just kind of narrate what you're seeing a little bit, and I'll actually take this moment to explain how I developed this project. So I built it in Unity. The scripts were written in C#, and we use photogrammetry to create a lot of these 3D models. Maybe skip forward a little bit.
Okay.
There we go. Yeah, and actually you can see the Pecha page right now is translucent. There we go. So when you unhover it, I make it fade in, and then so you can have more visibility, it fades out after about 2.5 seconds. And yeah, so a lot of these sculptures in real life are actually very hard to come across. They're not accessible, or they just don't exist. So that was a challenge, and to get around that, some of these models I actually generated from 2D images that we found online. Or from books, and kind of surprisingly created a pretty decent 3D model from them. You can find, maybe you're familiar with them, certain online services that can do this. I used Meshi, which is a pretty nifty site to use. Then I touched up some of the models in Blender. Let's see. So some key features of this app is actually the interaction system. So like I said, you can click on certain entities and it will display their information on the Pecha page, as you see here. You can scroll down and read more. And yeah, so there's a lot of different entities. There's maybe 100 or so in this app currently. And with all that information, it was kind of a challenge to manage a lot of that data. So the interaction system, I'll kind of explain some of the things that kind of went into that. So being able to hover and select these objects, you can kind of see upon hovering, they light up with a green kind of circle around them. And the snapping and bending of the ray actually is kind of a little challenge, but now we've got that working, as well as having the haptics and the UI sounds. So when you experience it, you can hear and have that feedback. Like I mentioned, the Pecha page fading in and out. All this had to be written, I had to write these scripts manually. And yeah, so even little details like the objects kind of floating in space, having a little animation to them, or else it kind of can be a little bit static. They kind of spin, some of them. And managing the metadata, like I mentioned, as well as writing a custom shader for this dotted line you see here, which is an emanation line. So you can see that shows the trajectory of the reincarnation. And you can kind of also infer that the time flows downward, so to clarify that. But yeah, anything else you want to mention about the video?
The app goes on and on. You see different colors for different transmission streams, purple for symbolic, green for natural language, and right now we've represented a lot of figures through what we were trying to do is make it resemble like a translucent like bead of a mala, because that's often a simile used to describe lineage histories that is continuous, like mala beads. And of course, we would love to get images for everyone and everything. And it goes down to the 14th century right now, but we want to extend it into the present. And you can use a joystick to swivel in different directions and view time from different perspectives. Okay, I'll stop that. All right, so what humanities questions does this project seek to answer? So VR as a tool for textual scholars. How can VR be a tool to map out conceptually challenging histories or relationships that have previously been depicted only through textual sources? How can we effectively communicate all the information in these histories? Like we said, there are continuous identities, reincarnations, different transmission modes, different scriptures in movement, so a lot of moving parts. These histories are dealing with time on multiple registers. How can we effectively communicate this nuance three-dimensionally? Restrictions and challenges. Again, we had zero funding, So Stanford Center for Spatial and Textual Analysis kindly lent us VR headsets and gave us some forums to workshop this idea. But definitely we would need funding to move forward. A lot of the primary source material remains untranslated. So there's the challenge first of accurately translating all this material, drawing out the relationships, and then applying it to a VR experience. There are no pre-existing 3D images on the web for most of the figures described in the histories. So we would have to create them ourselves or find them in different monasteries, collections, ask for permissions. And some of the monastic heads we've talked to have offered their resources for certain figures that they do have in collection, but then we would need to visit these places as well, so there's funding there. Potential audiences, scholars in DH interested in mapping conceptually challenging projects through VR, scholars of Buddhist studies, and practitioners of the Great Perfection tradition. So VR has not been accessible to most Vajrayana Buddhist communities in the past. So Vajrayana is usually the name for practitioners of Buddhism from Tibet and the Himalayan regions. So we hope to make VR accessible to them as a research and educational tool. So one of the monasteries we're in contact with, they have their own research branch in Tibetan of the lineage associated with Vimalamitra, so one of the key figures, and we want to incorporate that research in here. So future uses of VR for Buddhism. So in July 2024, we shared the VR app with members of the Namdroling Monastery, including Kempo Guru, who's featured there in a photo. He's one of the 3 heads of this monastery in Bailakuppe, India, which is the largest Tibetan settlement in the south of India. And he was extremely excited to see this VR experience. On top of giving us suggestions to expand the app, he also advised us to create a VR app that could help simulate meditation visualizations that prepare for death, or the bardo, the interim between this life and the next. And we're both very eager to continue with these projects and looking for sustainable ways of moving forward. And I just outlined here some of the conversations we had. So we were talking about this VR app and VR in general being an educational and research tool between Buddhists and Western institutions to collect data, to kind of have group efforts and research and putting this data in the histories about different figures and histories. VR as an aid for meditation visualizations. This is particularly important to Vajrayana Buddhism, where there's a lot of very complex visualization. And then finally, this is a conversation I've had recently with some other scholars. VR as a way to reconstruct sacred sites no longer accessible, either due to destruction or being exiled from these spaces. So these are all conversations spurred from this first small little prototype, which I'm very happy about. Yeah, and our next steps, secure some funding so we can complete this app. We want to extend the entities from the 14th century to the present day, find or create 3D renderings of all the figures we can, make the app available in Tibetan and English so users can toggle between the two. This could potentially be a language learning tool also for Tibetan monastics who have to learn to teach the history in English and learn it in Tibetan, and animate the lineage tree to play with its shape, display, unfolding and collapsing, showing the malleability of time even more. This is something I talked to Aftab about, but he was like, we can't do any of that until you have all the entities and all the metadata. And I was like, okay, so this is just the first step. And that's all we have for now. We're looking forward to your questions, comments, critiques, and more conversation. Thank you.
Well, thank you for sharing this with us. This is an incredible collaboration, and I'm so impressed that you did this much without any funding. Very impressive. I wanted to start with a question. Some of the questions I had were sort of answered through the presentation, but it gives me an opportunity to follow up more. I wanted to start off by asking what sort of your, what your inspiration was in terms of how you present the data. I was wondering, so you talk about this largely as a study aid for people preparing for the Great Perfection. They need to learn these lineages, which are very complex for all of the reasons that you explained. What are the study methods or aids that have been traditionally used in Tibetan communities. So I can imagine there might be visualization manuals that help you visualize these lineages through meditation, or there might be chanting, ways of passing on information through chants that are memorized, perhaps, or there might be mandalas, depictions of some lineages through mandalas. I don't know. It's just guessing. Are there sort of, or I guess, what are the native methods within Tibetan communities for studying this information and passing it on? And is there a way to integrate that?
Yeah, definitely. So the native methods, you could say, for learning the histories are usually there's a teacher who sits down and says, the first thing you must learn is the history. And then they teach for several hours, kind of from the beginning to the end, up to them. So the transmission from Buddhas all the way up to them through all the different teachers, and they explain all the relationships, funny stories. These stories are meant to be like a way, kind of like our stories today, to get you interested, excited. Some of these stories are a little bit miraculous in nature. And then it's actually very important, the histories, because in the visualizations, the very first visualization you do as a Vajrayana practitioner is to visualize the refuge tree of all of these Buddhas and teachers, starting with the first Buddhas in this lineage. Yeah. And so it's meant to somewhat mimic, of course, if you see 2D tankas, they're much more artistically rendered. We don't have that here because we needed the metadata and we don't have all the images. But it's meant to kind of resemble what we would see in a lineage tree all the way down to the current teacher.
So it is based on how someone would be instructed to visualize this mentally.
Exactly.
In a tree that is very similar to what you've done.
Yeah, and I think that's why, Kempo Guru, who you saw in the photo before, was very excited because he immediately saw the benefits for visualization practices, especially if we were to animate certain figures and kind of really try to mimic the flow of the meditation experience. Yeah.
Great, thank you. Do you want to ask that?
Yeah. Well, firstly, thank you for making this project. Lineages are really complicated. They're hard to understand. And one thing I was particularly curious about is you mentioned having these like two different audiences, which are the scholars and the practitioners. Mm-hmm. And I imagine, I think I sort of know that they have very different objectives in mind. Like scholars might want comparison tools, they might want sources for the information, whereas practitioners generally, I think, are more interested in like, how is this useful to me? How can I work with this?
Yeah.
Right? So how do you plan to juggle these two like very different user needs?
Mm-hmm. Well, first, maybe I would disrupt that binary. I know I made it myself, but for instance, the monks at Namdrolling Monastery, they have an institute of research that's quite rigorous themselves. It's just that most of Tibetan language scholarship, it never makes it onto the map of scholarship in the academy in the US or in Europe. And so they're very rigorous about sources and everything. And there's a whole history in Buddhist studies of text criticism and polemics that's very rich. So practitioners were traditionally all very rigorous. I think maybe what you're speaking to is like the modern, Western academic working in an academic institution and needing sources cited. I've been thinking about this a little bit. I don't know if in an app I would make all of that information visible. I think probably the best space for that would be like a publication. Like chapter 2 of my dissertation is incredibly dense, citing lots of scholars and a lot of long translations. What we have in the app are truncated translations that I picked and chosen based on conversations of what is the essential information we need. So maybe there's a medium for different kinds of interaction. You don't want a cluttered UI with a lot of stuff, but I have already incorporated the research of some French scholars who have published on the third lineage tree that I've been working on, as well as previous scholarship in English on the lineage tree for Vimalamitra, the middle figure. So it's already in there in the summation and in some of the figures. So some figures are talked about by some history, some are not. Maybe there's an elegant way to show that in the UI, but I didn't want to clutter that information here. This is just to kind of show you the bare bones idea. Yeah.
Well, I'd love to follow up with ideas for sort of where you would go next. It sounds like one of the masters you talked about already has an idea about incorporating ideas of the bardo and kind of deathbed practices, which would be really fascinating. That was one thing I was certainly thinking about in reading through your proposal and looking through the demonstration video, was could visualization practices be integrated in some way? That's certainly something that students I teach are often interested in. When we read text about visualization in translation, they're very interested in what these visualizations would look like and so on. And I'm curious if you've thought about how you would render visualizations, because on the one hand, some manuals are very precise. You have to visualize it in this exact way or it's wrong. But on the other hand, it is a subjective experience in the sense that it's happening in someone's mind, right? And so how can you put that, have you thought about how you would put that into a digital model?
Yeah, maybe you could talk on how animation stuff too, but
yeah. Well, I guess the direct answer to that is just in conversation with teachers to make sure that it's according to how they're teaching it.
Right.
But also as for animation we've been talking a lot about one of the main features that you'd want to, and I should preface this, I'm not like a Tibetan Buddhist scholar at all, so I've been learning a lot from Elaine. But as for one of the features we want to incorporate soon is the idea of time collapsing. So right now it's still overall time tends to flow downwards in the chart, with exception for actually the top of the chart. But to really kind of to show that the nature of time really not necessarily being linear throughout the whole thing, we also want to incorporate a animation that collapses all the entities into one, and then you can unfold it and see that way too, which I think is a very important concept when learning the history.
Yeah, and we were playing with different shapes.
I missed the presentation.
Oh, okay, yeah. And we were playing with different shapes to display the lineage tree, and that was something we did in the beginning, but then because we had so many entities, we were like, okay, first we have to make it linear, and then we can play with the shape afterwards. This is where Aftab really excels in thinking abstractly. It was very helpful working with him to translate these ideas into this format, because the way I think maybe is very different than the way the programming language thinks. And so it was extremely beneficial to talk to him and to have him draw out shapes and talk about different possibilities. In terms of visualizations, I think that for certain visualizations, which are very important, like Bardo visualizations, there are a diversity of different texts which have slightly different directions, but there is a general visualization that is very, very common, and explanation as well, such as the appearance of the 100 peaceful and wrathful deities. That's become very common. And so I think that there's a way to kind of find a happy medium where we are drawing from text-specific traditions, but making it general enough so that it could be interesting to practitioners of slightly different traditions. Yeah.
It is interesting. So you mentioned that you had given the VR experience or the prototype to some current practitioners of Dzogchen.
Yeah.
Can you tell me more about how that went and what you learned? What were the challenges?
Yeah. Do you want to share some of we presented?
Yeah, I guess I'm trying to remember. We shared to quite a few.
Kempo Tenzin, Kempo Yeshe.
Right.
Yeah.
She has a very good memory of all of this. So a lot of teachers, monastics. I might not be using the right terminology, but
Kempo is like the title in the Nyingma lineage and some other lineages of the highest monastic degree you could attain. So it's like a PhD in the monastic system. So, and Kenmo is the feminine form, which very recently they started having Kenmos graduate. Yeah.
Yeah.
If you want, I can mention.
Yeah,
a little.
maybe. Yeah. I
Yeah.
can explain better.
So most of this was like my network of friends and teachers. A lot have been teaching in English for some time. One is a PhD student at UC Berkeley, focusing on the same tradition, heart essence, great perfection as me. And they loved this actually, because for them it was like they've been learning this for years and years. And so they were seeing it mapped out in this way of they never considered before. And Khenpo Guru, who helps to head the Namdroling monastery, he said, oh, students can learn history through this in the future. They don't need to just sit through the teaching. They can learn history through this. I was like, that's exactly what I was thinking. Because I've been in many a setting where I'm kind of like watching how people are reacting to hearing the histories. And sometimes it just goes over people's heads. So I was like, we need a better way to teach this. If this is so important, and you need to retain it, and then it's important for visualization also, there must be a better way to present it. And so that, was really the impetus. And Khenpo Yeshe, who's at UC Berkeley, who also saw it, he was saying he'd never seen any Buddhist application in VR, nothing. And he was like, this is like, the future. He felt like this is such a better way of presenting the material that usually we're working on textually, like painstakingly. And it's even confusing for us. Like, what happened? Like, when was that? And then he's like, oh, this is great. And they were just very encouraging about it. So that gave us like an extra motivation to keep going.
That's great. Great feedback, and great to have that kind of close collaboration.
Yeah.
With the communities that are immediately relevant.
Yeah. We've also sat through these, learning the lineage history orally. It's very difficult. So, yeah.
So there are visualization practices once you start great perfection training, but it's not visualization of the lineages. So this is something new in that sense.
Well, it is visualization of the lineages. Yeah. You do have visualization of the lineages.
Oh, but you're not getting it, you're not visualizing it in a way that is as sort of systematic as what you've presented it as.
So what I would say is that before any visualization, usually practitioners recite what they call a lineage prayer. So it's just calling out the names of all of these different figures. And you have longer forms, you have shorter forms, you have medium forms of these lineage prayers. So when they call to mind these different figures, I guess an informed practitioner would know who's who, why they're important, how they're part of the history, how that history becomes a part of you in the visualization, because the visualization goes from outside and then it collapses into you because you become a part of that. You become what they call in this tradition a child of the enlightened ones. And so that's also, I think there's a direct correspondence to learning these long histories and then kind of having a different sense of, you could call it devotion, when reciting lineage prayers and performing these visualizations.
So first of all, thank you so much for this. I wanted to ask about the virtual space that you're creating and the relationship of the user's body to the virtual space. And there's two things that I'm curious about. One is the 3D models that are there, that are spinning. They're all miniatures. So why are they miniatures, and is it important to be able, or would it be important to be able to see them at life size in relation to your own body? And second, I wanted to know more about the vertical arrangement of the lineages and why it's vertical as opposed to horizontal, and why it's top-down as opposed to bottom-up, some of the decisions about arranging the lineages in space in that particular way.
Do you want to take some of those?
Yeah, we talked a lot before building the application on these same things. We were kind of thinking about what if we had time flow such that it's, you can walk forward or backward. I felt interaction-wise, it was more easy to navigate being able to ascend and descend, because it's like going, I think vestibularly, it's a little more, it can throw you off if you're moving forward and it's like, are you going too fast? And as for the miniaturization of the models, I think that was a little bit more arbitrary, but also kind of out of convenience because there's so many. If they were full size, then how could we fit so many? So yeah, but I think that's something that maybe in a different application or a different, because yeah, the purpose of this application is just to kind of see the relationship, not so much optimizing for visualizing the entities. But yeah, so I hope that answers that question.
Yeah, actually what you're saying makes me think of, in a lot of visualization manuals, when you're visualizing one figure and not the whole tree, part of the visualization requires that you play with scale. So it's playing with the imagination. You must increase it to the size of a building, a universe, then all the way down to the size of a hair. And it's kind of really pushing the limits of your own thinking through this visualization. So it would be cool in another application, maybe that's focused on one figure and not so many, where we could play with that scale a little more. In terms of the outer environment, there are things we want to improve on it. It's taking place in space right now, but it's kind of what we imagine to be when you read these histories. There's a beautiful setting of the Dzogchen ground from which all phenomena, beings, and worlds arise. And it sounds a little bit like this space-like place where lights first come. And yeah, so it's mimicking the cosmogony, I guess, the overall. That's why we set it in what looks like outer space. It's mimicking the cosmogony of these great perfection histories.
Thank you.
This is very interesting. I'm not familiar with this tradition, but from other religious traditions, it sounds very much like litanies, where you're just repeating various variations of deity.
Mm-hmm.
And those very often have a sound structure to them, especially when they're being taught, that takes meter to help understand, what's next.
Yeah.
And in addition, to get the lineage right. Is that part of this tradition? Is that something that is there? And would you want to incorporate that as well? I would love to see, I'd love to hear someone pronouncing these things as much in any rhythmic or kind of structured way that might exist, because I'm just imagining, my familiarity with Buddhist monasteries is they're very vocal.
Mm-hmm,
So
mm-hmm.
is that part of this?
Yeah, currently no, but we were talking about audio elements to maybe add in a future iteration, whether it's like a simple click and you hear the name pronounced, or, it is interesting what you're saying, like a litany or actually reading one of the lineage prayers, you hear the names. Those usually are almost, I don't think I've seen any that isn't in syllabic form. And so it's meant to be an aid to memory. The histories, on the other hand, they're much longer and much more detailed, and they're not in syllabic form. They tend to be more prose-like. So the information you see right now in the page with the descriptions, that's all taken from the histories and translated. Unfortunately, I don't think I've ever seen, nor have I myself, successfully translated from Tibetan verse form into English verse form. I know some people have tried doing that with varying levels of success.
But even hearing it just in Tibetan,
Exactly.
it brings
Yeah.
a different element to it.
Yeah, and that was something that we definitely, I think we want to do in a future iteration. As to what that might be exactly, I think we'll consult with a few other people and think of different options, what might make the most sense in this experience. Yeah. Oh yeah. Hi.
Hi, my name is Jenny. I'm an undergrad here at USC, and I really love this project. I especially love the aspect that this could be served as a visual aid for tantric practices. And my question is, have you ever encountered any ethical challenges in digitalizing the specific school of Buddhism? Because I'm not too familiar with Tibetan Buddhism, but in other schools I've interacted with, there's both the problem of maybe certain sacred texts or sites that they prohibit us from filming or taking pictures of, and also some traditional believers, maybe they're against digital, or maybe they prefer books, or maybe more physical forms.
Yeah. Well, luckily, I write about this in my dissertation as well, kind of the ethics of secrecy and stuff like this. Luckily, the histories are open to everyone. So they're not into tantric practice territory yet. And so everyone we talked to about the lineage history, like showing this visually, they didn't have any issue with this at all. In fact, they wanted more images. There are, as you probably are familiar, certain images that are off limits unless one receives an initiation. We're not dealing with any of those figures here. These are all figures that are well known in history that you could see entering a monastery, opening a book, going to a library, maybe sometimes you can find some images. So we're not in that territory. For future visualizations, if we're asked to do certain ones, there might be an issue of maybe version control, where we would have one version for practitioners and one version for maybe the general public.
This was a wonderful presentation, thank you. I'm a scholar of literature, and I'm working with some texts that deal with time in interesting and complicated ways, and I've been doing some digital projects that involve media-rich annotations to try to give the reader that sense of time. So I'm interested when you talked about time collapsing or out of time or nonlinear time, in addition to moving up and down, how do you imagine portraying these different types of time in this space?
Yeah. Do you want to talk about the shape you were thinking of?
Oh, yeah. Originally, I'd still kind of think this would be cool to implement, but as for, it's hard to, I guess that's why you need a 3D model to explain it. But yeah, so basically I was thinking of implementing a torus where, yeah, it's really hard to explain
torus
succinctly.
is kind of like a donut shape.
Yeah. Yeah, basically, I'm not sure if this would directly answer your question, but in the context of what we're doing here, so let's say you have an entity. Well, if an entity exists across time, I mean, time is not just linear time, but let's call it circular time, then, but actually exists in different times as well, so linear and, I was toying with the idea of actually representing that where an entity is more like a pillar that is traversing the center of the donut. Call it the what do you call the donut holes?
Yeah.
The ones that, yeah. So the hole of the donut, basically a rod traversing from the center to the extremity, and then I feel like it's hard to, that's just the elevator pitch of it.
Yeah, I don't know if that made a lot of sense, but instead of like an up and down, like time would not be hierarchical or horizontal necessarily. Like you could view it in different ways, especially with a torus shape, because it doesn't have one beginning or end exactly. And so you could play with the shape of that in different ways and how entities are related to each other through that shape. This is what I was really excited about, but Aftab had to scale me back to just make this version first. But yeah, I would love to hear about what you're doing and think of ways to represent this, because this is, I think, the most interesting part of the literature for me as well, and would benefit the most from three-dimensional rendering.
Yeah, hi, I'm Doug Daniels. I'm a librarian at UCLA in the Data Science Center, and it's less of a question and more of a suggestion. You mentioned that you're challenged with funding and creating models at these different temples and sites and stuff. My colleagues in the digital library program created these DSLR kits that they sent out to different, I think this was St. Mary's Monastery. It was a palimpsest collection that it was 2D images, but they digitized them.
Cool.
You could do that with photogrammetry if you have willing participants on the other side.
Oh.
You could just send them a DSLR.
So we could use your service to send a kit out to Bailakupe, India.
Theoretically, yes. But yeah, you could send the kit out, have them, with some bare bones instructions on how to do the setup, have them take the photos, and then you can do the processing yourself and get your 3D models that way.
That would be wonderful.
Less fun than going in person.
Yeah. Because that was exactly the challenge you were talking about with some teachers. They were like, who has a camera? Who has, like, what do you need exactly? And we were like, oh, like, how do we get these images, yeah. That's amazing. I would love to talk more, figure out how to get these kits available to others, yeah.
Thank you. I'm sorry I missed the presentation, but I was looking to the rest of the material. And I was wondering, I've been interested a bit since I work a lot on textual traditions, on the so-called treasure revealers, Terton, and so this tradition of religious figures who basically claim to discover ancient scrolls in certain earthly locations in Tibet. And then there are also those other terma, those other texts that are instead mined, and then are still written down. So I've been following some Tibetologists who've been working on it, like Antonio Terrone from Northwestern. And I thought that this application, this project would really work very well for something like that, because you could visualize basically what we know until now. And so I'm wondering, like these texts found here, and then you can virtually indeed see the place and the text, and maybe read the text or the translations of it. So I wonder if you ever thought to expand it.
To like reading the text, or?
And to also locate those spaces. So basically reconstruct the landscape as well. That would be amazing.
Yeah.
Maybe difficult, but
yes. So the lineage that I work on the right-hand side, associated with Padmasambhava's lineage is all treasure text. So what you see there, if you're in the app, is you see a big jump of time from like the 8th century into the 13th, 14th century, and that's because there was a text that was buried and then recovered at a future time by someone who was a reincarnation of the young princess. And so that is something I work with directly. As for making the actual scripture available on this site, I don't know. In my intertextual heat map that I built with SESTA, I did have that whole scripture available in Tibetan, and I traced its intertextuality with the larger Great Perfection tradition in this heat map form, where you could see side by side all the relationships. So I did that for that project, but for this one, I don't think, because there's so much text, if we're actually going to use the scripture somehow, then it would be an overwhelming amount of text. I almost feel like that needs to be a separate application for readability. So here it's really just the history of what's transmitted, the same way that the same information you would learn if you're learning about a Great Perfection history. Who's who, how did this come down, what's happening, what's being transmitted to who, like that, yeah. But yeah, I agree that this is a great medium for people working on the treasure tradition in particular, yeah.
I thank you very much for this. I very much enjoying how you're grappling with sort of representing 4D and 3D and all of that. My question, I think, is kind of goes back to how this might articulate with a kind of ongoing practice, right? Because I see this as absolutely an excellent resource for people who want to learn these traditions, right? But also there's some potential pitfalls there, right? Because you're dealing with this kind of transmission from teacher to student for ages now of this information, and I imagine the way that this gets told is sort of different every time, and there's a lot of learning that happens from teaching. So there are, I think, potential pitfalls to applying this technology to that practice. So I was just kind of wondering how you sort of envision this tool being used, this resource being used by practitioners, by teachers, when it's sort of fully fleshed out and developed.
Well, I guess I imagined it as a really living thing. Like, one thing we talked with Kempo Guru about was, wouldn't it be great if there are VR headsets available in the monastery, and then the monks who are conducting research on these histories, they can also add things as they uncover more. And he was very excited about that possibility as well. And we were talking about, well, first let's build the first iteration and have it complete, and then all of this could be a possibility. I think that, are you talking about different people talking about histories in different ways, or how that could be a problem for?
Yeah, I guess, I mean, sorry if my question's like super convoluted or whatever, but
Oh, no.
I'm trying to think through all of these issues all at once. But I think that, I'm sort of envisioning, this sort of ongoing practice of teaching these histories that's occurring in these monasteries, and then the sort of new tool that comes in. And I'm kind of wondering, like, how you feel that could be or should be situated alongside or integrated into the sort of ongoing teaching practice.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's maybe a larger conversation to have with more participants. I can just share what we had in preliminary conversations. I don't think that there will be a day when, unless this lineage dies out completely, when histories aren't taught, because that's just how important it is. Traditionally, a lot of students are just memorizing, constantly memorizing and reciting aloud. So you see that in a lot of monasteries. I think as an aid for further, for memorization, for learning English, these are all things that we already talked about with Kempo Guru. But I think beyond that, there's an interest in a lot of these monasteries in the Tibetans I know who have had their training in the monastic system, but maybe are now living in the US or in other places, to actually have more training in other technologies as well. There's kind of a big gap right now in these worlds and what's available and what kind of education is possible. And I think that from most of the different teachers I know who are helping to run these schools in different monasteries, whether in Nepal or in India, they're all very interested in having technology and science and other subjects available to their students so that their students can kind of converse with the larger world as well. So I see this as mutually beneficial, and as to how that might take shape, I think only future conversations can tell. Yeah.
And that's all the time that we have.